Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar, whose title is actually a question. Is it time to look beyond co-production and focus on evidence use in development? My name is Peter Taylor. I'm Director of Research at the Institute of Development Studies, and welcome to all of those who are joining us online today for what we think should be a very stimulating conversation today. Just a reminder, quick, of as we're on Zoom, I think everyone is already muted, but if you have any questions or comments, please place them in the chat. The session is being recorded, so it can be made available online afterwards. And we also encourage participants to use social media, including X, formerly Twitter, to share ideas from the event. And the X tag is in the chat. And please do keep an eye on the chat as we go, because a number of links will be placed in there, which will give an indication of how to access some of the material. So this event follows the publication last July of a new study of knowledge translation in the Global South, funded by the International Development Research Centre of Canada, IDRC. And this comprised of a year-long accompanied learning process or learning journey between the research team from IDS and OTT and IDRC. All those acronyms will become clear in due course, along with a steering group of Southern knowledge translation practitioners and researchers. We undertook an exploratory literature review and primary research in the Global South, and we'll hear about that more in a moment. And the research made a series of recommendations for research funders to create a more enabling environment for the use of research in the Global South, and also highlighted some of the gaps in our knowledge and a possible future research agenda around getting evidence into use, which is the focus of today's seminar. So through this discussion today, we want to explore opportunities to address gaps in the research on how evidence shapes behavior, policy and practice, and the mechanisms that may enhance these processes. And by the end of the webinar, we hope to have identified some research questions and inquiry areas that might offer a way forward. And again, you will find links to the research outputs and other things in the chat. So our structure today is as follows. I'll be moderating the session, and in a moment we'll hear some introductory remarks from IDRC's Kristen Corbett. Kristen is a Senior Strategic Knowledge Translation Officer with the Policy and Evaluation Division at IDRC, based in Ottawa, Canada. And just to say, she holds a master's degree in global studies, and before joining IDRC, worked with the UN's Office on Drugs and Crime in Vienna and Cairo on program and partnership development in the field of criminal justice reform. Then we will move on to a presentation, which will be made by authors of the reports I've just mentioned, and they are, in order of speaking, Emily Combaz, an independent researcher and consultant in social sciences with over 19 years experience in academia and policy and practice-oriented work on issues of human rights, development, peace building, and humanitarian action. And she led the exploratory literature review for the KT in the Global South Research Inquiry. We will then hear from Fajri Siraga, PhD candidate at the University of Amsterdam, researching civil society-based knowledge production by non-governmental organizations in Indonesia. And he's acted as research and policy consultant for On Think Tanks, the OTT, previously mentioned, and for Indonesia's Ministry of Research and Higher Education, the Knowledge Sector Initiative, and the Partnership for Governance Reform. And he led the primary research for the KT in the Global South Research Project. And then we will hear from my colleague, James Georgilakis, Director of Evidence and Impact at IDS. He directed the ESRC and FCDO-funded Impact Initiative, and he leads IDRC's COVID-19 Responses for Equity Knowledge Translation Support Project, and KT support for IDRC's Clean Energy for Development program. And he led the KT in the Global South Research Inquiry. So when we have heard from Kristen and our presenters, we will then move to a discussion involving three further speakers who I will introduce in a moment, because I don't want anybody to be forgotten due to waiting to hear who everyone is. And they will be bringing great knowledge and experience to bear. And as I said, I'll introduce them after the presentation. We'll try to weave in as best we can your questions and comments into the discussion, and hopefully we'll also have a bit of time remaining at the end for the speakers to respond to further questions or comments from the chat. So I think it's going to be a very stimulating, very lively conversation, and I hope that everyone is going to gain greatly from the experiences and ideas and insights that are going to be shared. And again, we welcome your comments and questions in the chat. Kristen, over to you.
Thank you so much, Peter. It is a real pleasure to be here today. Because while this promises to be the start of an important conversation around a forward-looking research agenda, it also marks a really important milestone in what's been a 2-year learning journey for many of us. As Peter noted, I work for the International Development Research Center, so IDRC, and we support research institutions in the Global South to find solutions to context-specific development challenges in areas such as global health, climate adaptation, democratic inclusive governance, and more. So for more than 50 years, IDRC's mandate has maintained that Southern perspectives and expertise are needed to drive development and response. So it follows that we see our primary responsibility towards knowledge translation being to enable the researchers we support to define, adjust, and navigate the strategies and processes for moving research into action based on their contextual knowledge and experience. But our IDRC strategy to 2030 commits us to do more to share knowledge for greater uptake and use. And this isn't about more or even better research outputs or communications products. Rather, it's an opportunity for us to be more intentional and strategic about engaging the actors that can help us achieve development outcomes. So our collaboration with IDS, OTT, and the steering group that led this study was motivated by 2 things. First, a real interest in contributing to a more globally representative and sector diverse evidence base on knowledge translation theory and practice. From the outset, we were keen to interpret KT, or knowledge translation, broadly as the process of moving research into action. So focusing much more on function and purpose than on narrowly defined activities or roles. And our second motivation was a sincere hope that the learning could give us as IDRC, as well as other research funders, some advice and guidance in terms of how we incentivize, enable, and support knowledge translation moving forward. So there are a lot of takeaways from this research endeavor, and I won't speak to all of them, but I do want to zero in on one in particular. So the study clearly underscores that the real challenge for KT is not one of translation. So for example, from knowledge producer to knowledge user, but rather of equitable co-production and sense making. And it argues that funders should create more space for the co-production of research and change agendas. And IDRC is taking this very seriously and giving thought to the range of programming and granting mechanisms that we can leverage to make incremental changes. So for example, we're giving thought to how we can make research planning funds more systematically available for researchers, users, and beneficiaries to establish or strengthen relationships and trust in order to invest the time and effort needed to co-develop research proposals. And interestingly, the release of this KT study coincided with the publication of a framework for evaluating research co-production and a new assessment instrument, which promises to make a unique contribution to the design, management, and evaluation of co-production. And I'll put the links in the chat, but these resources titled Research Quality Plus for Co-Production will soon be available on the IDRC website in English, French, and Spanish. And so you can rest assured that we'll be working to promote and test, adapt, and refine these moving forward. We're also collaborating closely with several other public and private funders who are trying to catalyze greater investment in equitable research co-production, sense-making, and use. And just last week, we supported 2 workshops in the UK and the US that weren't mentioning. So the first was made possible through a collaboration with Southern Voice, IDS, and Canada House in London to discuss equity in research for development partnerships and converge around some key areas of action for funders. And the other was convened by members of the Transforming Evidence Funders Network and the Aspen Global Change Institute to identify actions funders can take to build out and use the evidence base around research co-production. And I'm flagging the existence of this Transforming Evidence Funders Network because it serves as a really great segue into the importance of today's discussion. We're gathering today to surface gaps in how we understand the interaction of research with policy and practice. And one of the areas of interest expressed by funders in this funders network is research on research use. So there's indeed growing acknowledgement that for workable solutions to have real world impact, research funders need to be investing in the processes that increase the probability of use and impact in particular contexts. And I'll close by quickly saying that our hope is that by investing in the scholarship and practice around evidence use, we can help catalyze positive change in research for development by motivating funders and researchers around the world to keep learning, innovating, and adapting. So with that, I'll pass it back to you, but really excited for our conversation today. Thanks, Peter.
Great, thanks, Kristen. And I think that's a really helpful introduction to the presentations, which we're going to hear now, which will speak to the work which has generated this report, which has very recently become available and is getting a lot of attention. So I'm going to pass directly to Emily, and then Emily, I know you will continue then to pass to the other presenters, to Fajri and to James. And yeah, in the next half hour, we look forward to hearing from what you have to share. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Hello. So my name is Emily Combas, and I was the lead researcher on the literature review. So I'll share my screen so you can follow along. I have a presentation that I can share. So I led the exploratory mapping of the literature alongside my colleague Mel Connor and James Jargalakis, who is with us today. So just to place the literature review again within how this collaborative research was set up, the literature review interacted with the two other components of the research. So one of them was the learning journeys that we talked about, which are successive rounds of dialogue between us, the research team, our funder, IDRC, and a steering group made up of researchers and practitioners from the Global South who are experts at KT, and some of them are with us today on the panel. Then we had our review of the literature, which I'll speak to, and then the primary research that Fajri was the lead on about the lived experiences of KT actors in the Global South. So focusing on the literature review, what were we trying to do? The goal of the review was to explore the strategies used to enhance the use of knowledge, and knowledge broadly defined, not just academic research, in policy and practice in Southern contexts. So the way we went about doing that was to do an exploratory review of academic, practitioner, and policy literature published since 2017 in English, French, and Spanish. One interesting bit of the research was we set the search terms collaboratively with the steering group. So even the research itself was really informed by our Southern colleagues' perspectives on what the key terms relevant in their contexts would be. And broadly speaking, the methodology was to conduct a systematized, not systematic, but systematized review using the search terms, to then do a thematic content extraction and then write up a narrative synthesis of our findings. So what did we find? Once we applied the inclusion criteria for the searches, we had 202 references that we could include. And overall, in broad strokes, most references were written in English. Despite our best efforts, they still focused very much on the health sector, even though we were trying to, be very broad, because we know historically the KT literature has really focused on the health sector in the global north. But unfortunately, this is also what came out in from the review. So that's one topic of discussion. Most references covered several regions at once, which was good for comparative purposes. And most originated from scientific, mostly academic sources. So when we started to assess the state of knowledge and research, two things jumped out at us. The first was, overall, actually, there is a good knowledge base. There's generally good coverage on many aspects of KT. However, some areas really appeared to be under-researched. I'll just give you a few examples, and if you want more, you can have a look at the reports. So, for example, there was not that much on KT in Asia and the Pacific, or in rural areas, or in contexts of war or autocracy. A big gap was also that there were few references focused on KT that really embedded longer timeframes for study. So that's an issue, obviously, when we try to think about impact. Another big problem was few references really embedded an outlook on structures of inequalities and their intersections. So few references thought about or studied how class, caste, gender, disabilities, age, race, ethnicity, migration, or legal status affect KT. And another gap was there were a few really good studies, but not that many studies about how to contextualize KT. So say you get your hands on something that looks really like a good practice in KT. How do you know if it's going to work elsewhere? So, you know, there's not that much on what works, where, when, for whom, how, and why. And in that regard, I think the primary research that Fajri is going to present was really relevant in starting to shed light on that and fill that gap. We were guided by several research questions, and I'm not going to run you through all of them. I'm just going to look at two of them and highlight for each of them just one or two interesting highlights that came out from specific references. So one question we asked ourselves was, okay, if you look at KT practices in the Global South, are there differences depending on who the key stakeholders or actors are, or depending on what their goals for KT were? One reference in that regard made an interesting distinction between two types of knowledge brokers. One type is actually really quite well researched. This one is about facilitating the use of knowledge, especially academic research, into policy and practice. So usually that's done through knowledge intermediation, knowledge translation, or knowledge co-creation. And so there's quite a strong evidence base showing what the success factors are, which is, you know, building good relationships with the key stakeholders, having familiarity with them, coming in with credibility, and building and sustaining trust. But there's another type of knowledge brokering that's much less well studied, and it's about brokering between knowledge cultures. So brokering between different levels of knowledge, like local and international knowledge, or brokering between scientific knowledge, sectoral knowledge, and informal local knowledge, for example. And there, the key skill is to be able to act as a cognitive bridge between different types of contents, inquiries, and languages. So I think that's a really helpful way of thinking about the different functions or setups of how evidence gets used. Another lead question we had was, are there differences in KT strategies and KT successes by settings? So what we found was the literature said there wasn't significant differences between policy sectors or, for example, depending on the academic discipline. However, on the other hand, there were really interesting differences by geography, especially when you think about multiple scales from macro to micro. And I just want to run you through that. So if we start at very large scales, one interesting finding actually to begin with was findings about what we know about KT. So what makes up KT capacities, what the key factors, positive and negative are, what relevant interventions might be. Overall, they retain validity across high, medium, and low income contexts. However, there are differences. For example, KT capacity is higher in upper middle income than in low income countries. But also, most fundamentally, there are significant differences between countries and within countries. And within the same country, if you look at different, for example, research institutions, there are also going to be differences in KT capacities and strategies. There's not a lot of information about that in the literature. But for example, it seems that when you compare institutions in the same country, those that are part of an effective research network seem to be doing better at KT. But then the fascinating thing is there's still further levels down. So for example, within the same institution or within the same research network, there are differences depending on the research type, the research topic, and likely the research, the associated research culture. And I'll just give you two examples from studies we came across in the literature. One of them looked at the same network working on health. for researchers, and they found that researchers who work on health systems were likelier to do KT than those who worked in basic or clinical research. And even more intriguing, within the same research network, researchers who were working on childhood diarrhea consistently had worse KT capacity than researchers who worked on malaria prevention, contraception, or tuberculosis treatment. So clearly, there's a lot to find out about really specific contexts and what affects KT. And in closing, I just wanted to share my own critical reflections on the literature that came out at me to me when I was thinking about what we were finding. And I have 4 key points here. The first one is about systematicity. Clearly, there are some gaps in the literature. And for me, being trained primarily in political science, a big one was, I think the KT field really would benefit from reconnecting or connecting more to the wider social science field, especially for studies on what context means or power and advocacy. The second thing is knowing when KT is not the right question or not the right answer. Sometimes, for example, you can be doing the best KT in the world if there are powerful interests, I don't know, within policy that have decided that they're not going to do what you want them to do. It's not going to happen. And so the solution is not more or better KT in that instance. It might be about, building political collective power to enact change. And sometimes problems are at the field level. And this is the difference between KT, between knowledge translation and knowledge implementation. And sometimes I think anthropological studies show us the issue is less about knowledge translation and more about how local norms, local practical norms, ways of doing things affect how knowledge gets implemented. The third point was being reflexive about the KT field. If we take seriously the idea that power is important in KT, then the KT field itself is part of power relations. And so if we think that, then one thing that I really didn't see talked about much in the literature is how to do no harm in KT. And the other thing is accepting the idea of having difficult conversations around plural knowledge. So if you think about false beliefs or, curing autism, for example, yes, there are forms of local knowledge that are actually based on scientifically false beliefs. So that needs to be taken into account. And the final thing is, there is really a gap in systematically building transformative intersectional approaches to power into the KT field. That's clearly, in my view, a gap that needs to be addressed. Thank you.
Okay, Emily, I guess that's the cue for me to start with the primary research findings, right? So thanks, Emily. Let me just start by saying that the primary research team benefited hugely from Emily's work with the lit review. And some of her findings really hinted on where we should be looking at in terms of gathering more concrete data from the field. So I will now present some of the main findings from the primary research. I was leading the team consisting of Marcela Morales, Julie LaFrance, Jessica Correa, and also Enrique from OTT. So we were given the task to actually find out more about what is happening in the KT field in different contexts in the Global South. So we collected data we managed to amass quite rich data from a lot of practitioners. So we did the data collection last year between June and November. And during those months, during those 5-6 months, we managed to first start with a quick survey that we distributed to mostly funders from IDRC. But then we also decided to talk and have deeper conversations with 4 program officers of IDRC. But the main data were from the key informant interviews. So we had the chance to talk to different practitioners coming from different fields in different regions. In total, we managed to interview 21 of them, most of them practicing KT and doing research in the African context, but also in Latin America, Asia, and also to a colleague in Egypt, and also to different representatives of funding organizations and experts from the global north. And then on top of that, we also looked at 6 different case studies, which we hoped would give us a more concrete lived experiences of from different projects that revolve around knowledge translation, but mostly start with the knowledge production part. So we also looked at 8 shorter cases or smaller cases that also added to the insights that we gathered from the key informant interviews. And then lastly, we asked a few of our colleagues who we interviewed to also share their thoughts in form of blog articles that we call think pieces, and asking them to actually not only think of the current state of KT, but how they envisage KT in the future or in the medium to long run, medium term. So this is how we collected the data from the primary research. And I will now run through some of the main findings, really. First of all, we wanted to understand how our informants or these KT practitioners see and perceive KT. So generally, knowledge translation as a term is well understood, but all of our colleagues that we talked to, they prefer to use different terms or labels, actually, that they feel are more useful in their field. And the most frequent term that came up is actually evidence use, which we are also using in the title of our event. But apart from evidence use, a lot of these practitioners also use the term knowledge to policy, research uptake, research impact, or evidence to policy. So you can get a sense of what people are actually working on and working with based on the different notions or labels they use. And these are mostly used in the field of development and international development. That being said, evidence use is usually used in the context of trying to achieve a certain impact, be it informing policy, decision-making, or behavior change. And also what we found out from the interviews is that, and this is something that we think we can all agree on, is that KT cannot be cleanly separated from other activities within the knowledge spectrum or knowledge production spectrum. It involves a lot of different activities and efforts to promote the use of evidence. And what might be interesting and might be a distinction from other knowledge ecosystems is that in the Global South, a lot of these practitioners are doing more than one job. So KT is one of a set of different activities that usually starts with knowledge production and is followed out by knowledge dissemination and also advocacy. So a lot of these informants and a lot of these practitioners have different roles and different tasks at hand. What is more straightforward is the question about who is excluded from KT processes. So what we gathered from our informants is that a lot of people who actually are the main beneficiaries of KT are also excluded from the process, which include young people, people in rural communities, indigenous people, the urban poor, women, and senior citizens. But these are the most frequent social groups that came up in that question. So these are bystanders of KT, even though they are actually also the main beneficiaries. Another aspect that is probably more nuanced than people excluded from KT is how to actually measure a KT in outcomes. But what we wanted to take away from the primary research is that a lot of practitioners in the Global South are hoping for a more context-sensitive project design when they're involved or when they're supported by international donors. And by having a more context-sensitive project design, the hope is that for them to be working with more accurate and more tangible success indicators, as suggested by Kirchhoff, for example. He mentioned that it is quite important for funders to understand the context in which they want to see KT taking place, the difficulties the practitioners are having, the chance to actually adjust certain indicators, metrics to accommodate some of the unique context they are facing or challenges they are facing in their work. So context matters, and indicators are ideally locally driven, flexible, and focused on usefulness. Now, this is probably one of the most I'd say pivotal findings from the research, the questions about enablers and challenges to doing KT in the context of the Global South. So, but this is of course debatable because we also we try to overemphasize, we try to avoid overemphasizing the Southern uniqueness, or we wanted to avoid overemphasizing the Southern KT, because we also concluded that in many contexts, the challenges might be quite similar between Global North and the Global South. But nevertheless, the main challenges that we encountered were the politicization of science and evidence, and the informality of policy processes taking place in many contexts in countries of the Global South, the lack of participation and communication channels, lack of recognition of KT as a function in itself, the exclusion of less powerful or influential audiences like the excluded groups like we mentioned before, insufficient institutional support, which is usually reflected in the lack of public funding for research and science in many contexts, and the lack of capacity, be it organizational on the individual level. But on the other side, we also saw that there are certain factors or determinants that can make KT a successful process, such as coherence between KT practice and relevant local methods in terms of communication, the inclusion of those groups that are usually not participating in other channels, the availability of funding, trust, not just between grantees and the funders, but also trust among the local stakeholders, a culture of generating, valuing, and using evidence, and also a strong science and knowledge system, knowledge ecosystem, should I say. So what we know so far based on the primary research that we've done is that KT in itself is a universal process. So there might be not so many distinctions between Global North and Global South contexts, but then there are certain features that we think are quite important to make KT successful. But then again, are detrimental also if these factors are not available for the practitioner. So the 4 points that we bring up here, and we've mentioned this in the learning journeys and in the previous rounds of discussion. So weaker and less established knowledge system, scientific communities, and scientific advisory systems, the lack of these actors, the lack of these institutions automatically creates challenges in doing KT. And then also political contexts that are dominated by corruption, patronage, informality, a lot of informal processes would hinder a formal KT process, and are unfavorable conditions towards evidence use. And then also structural inequalities and limited public funding for science and research. We also want to highlight again that regional differences play a crucial role in KT. For example, in Latin America, even though they are facing similar challenges, but our informants from Brazil and elsewhere acknowledge that even between countries in Latin America, it might be difficult to what Emily referred to as brokering between knowledge cultures. So this is something that appeared in the primary research findings. And I will just conclude by leaving us with some more questions that we found intriguing, or I personally find intriguing, is that to what extent should and can we actually generalize these different contexts in the Global South, if at all? And then how do we Southern KT practitioners or Southern researchers prefer to measure success? What forms of research do they need to achieve impact in a KT sense? And should these factors be designed from the beginning? Should a particular audience should there be a particular audience in mind from the beginning of the designing of KT project? And also, how can knowledge ecosystems be strengthened given the varying contexts in the Global South? I leave it here. These are the main findings from the primary research. I hope you can look into it in the final report. And now I'll leave some of the last conclusions or the other takeaways to James. So over to you, James.
Thanks, Fajri. You and Emily are quite a hard act to follow. So I'm just going to try and provide some summary points that will help move us on to the discussion we will be having shortly with others on this subject. And this is really about this central overarching question that Peter posed at the start, which is, we're looking for opportunities to further new ways and understandings of how you get evidence into use. So I'm going to try not to repeat too much of what's already been said, but you've already heard how this is a fragmented field of study. That globally there's lots of evidence, there's lots of research, there's lots of knowledge, but it's pretty fragmented across disciplines and between geographies. And there's an awful lot of it which sits within the global north, and it's a bit disproportionately focused perhaps on health. And you've also already heard from Emily and Fajri that this literature doesn't engage very adequately with Southern perspectives around structural power, gender and equity in knowledge systems and cognitive justice. And there's seemingly quite a lot of duplication of effort between sectors and geographies. But, there are some areas where there's really not very much at all that we could find that's being kind of rigorously documented. Next slide, please. So this kind of idea of the domination of Northern concepts, it comes through very strongly from our report. If you look at the complete report, we found, perhaps not surprisingly, that knowledge translation actors, whether they be researchers, community members, policy actors, intermediaries, they have multiple alternative and complementary ways of understanding KT, however you want to define it, or evidence-informed policy and practice. But much of this work is informal in nature. And in the North, I think I'm saying this as a person from the North, we tend to formalize it. We tend to kind of want to put it into a structure, produce a theory of change. Most of these practitioners are framing evidence for specific audiences, even if their desired kind of outcomes or these pathways to impact that we talk about are not always explicitly stated or framed around formal policy and practice spaces. And so, as Fajri's explained, we also found you cannot cleanly separate KT from many other activities that relate in some shape or form to the production and promotion of knowledge or evidence. So the whole vocabulary of knowledge translation and understandings of this interaction between science and society, I think, might be so heavily influenced by this field's kind of so-called roots in the Northern literature, that just applying these concepts in this study really became problematic. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm not going to spend long on this, because does the world need another analytical framework? Perhaps not, but it's given that our focus today is on kind of further research, I wanted to very quickly share with you where we sort of ended up. So by the end of the study, we had developed a completely revised analytical framework for looking at KT. And the reason for this is we wanted something which allowed you to go in and not base the inquiry on any form of assumption or any kind of preconceived idea of what KT is, who does it, and for whom, right? And we wanted to be able to identify a combination of outputs and stakeholders as part of that conversation, because when you talk to practitioners, that's often what they'll talk to you about. They'll often talk to you about the things they're doing and the stakeholders that they're engaging with, or the communities that they're part of. And so those two outer rings, and these are just examples, by the way, I've just populated it for the purposes of providing you with this example. The two outer rings combine those ideas of different mechanisms, which, as you've heard, the options don't vary a huge amount between North and South, and a list of potential stakeholders. And the idea is you would work collaboratively with a group to generate those options for those two outer rings. And having done that, what the inner ring then the middle of that circle prompts us to do is to consider what assumptions or underlying ideas are being made around what these causal processes actually look like. How does research evidence or different forms of knowledge interact across these channels or mechanisms and stakeholders? And the reason we put it into a sort of circular thing is because we recognize that those different causal processes, they're not mutually exclusive, right? So it's very rare to find one of these in the absence of any of the others. They tend to combine, but what we found looking at the case studies and through our interviews is often you have a strong emphasis or a stronger emphasis in one area more than another. So these causal processes, I think, might be familiar to some of the people on joining this webinar, because they are kind of based on a wider literature. You know, the idea of knowledge transfer is that more kind of linear, transactional type of movement of knowledge or research evidence from one group to another. The idea of knowledge integration, where you attempt to embed a scientific or research advisory service or some other research and evidence synthesis function within a particular policy sphere. Knowledge brokering, again, a commonly used concept that describes this kind of these intermediaries that play a key role in trying to bridge knowledge production with knowledge use. And then finally, these more complex ideas, these more interactive ideas of how you address a knowledge system. Perhaps you're challenging knowledge hierarchies, perhaps you're attempting to create a more enabling environment for the co-production of research. So this wheel, which we know has its limitations, is there to be used as an analytical tool to be able to try and understand what's going on. And we hope people will critique this and will, you know, develop it further or adapt it for their own purposes. Next slide, please. So we talked about the bridging, the theory and the practice of getting evidence into use. So models for understanding the influence and impact of research evidence have definitely moved on a lot, and you know, generally now more kind of complexity aware, and there's more discussion about interactivity and interactive systems. But we do still see a bit of a gap between the theory and the practice, between the academics who work on this and the practitioners who do it in real life. And perhaps you could argue in health and education, this is a bit more common, but it's certainly not common everywhere. And knowledge translation, and sorry again for repeating what's been said already by Emily and Fadri, but knowledge translation has definitely been too narrowly framed by actors, predominantly in the global north, for whom, you know, technical approaches to knowledge translation focused on instrumental outcomes still seem to be pretty dominant. And finally, well, not quite finally, but as Fadri mentioned, and you know, we've really tried not to other the global south, but hey, I mean, there's an irony there, right? Our report's called Knowledge Translation in the Global South, and that irony does not escape the research team. But over the course of conducting this research, we've had a lot of debates about this, because as Emily has explained, the differences within regions may be as important as the differences between them. And so there's real opportunities to share learning that spans sectors and geographic boundaries, and of course, treat everyone's knowledge as equally valid. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the last slide. I know I'm out of time, Peter. So why did we call this event Looking Beyond Co-Production, Exploring the Challenges of Evidence Use? Well, it was partly me trying to be a bit provocative, but the reason is that having completed this project and kind of on reflection, we recognize that, you know, there's incredibly valuable work going on in promoting equitable research partnerships. And Christine put this very well at the beginning in terms of talking about IDRC's own commitments in those areas. And it's so important. But we also recognize that if you focus very heavily or even exclusively on research methods, research funding, and research partnerships, we might be in danger of ignoring an even deeper set of issues around research use. And this is related to the point made about Emily's point about cognitive bridges, and the real challenge being bridging different ways of knowing. So, you know, we think this is important. And these potential opportunities to explore research use. They relate to gaps that we've observed in the literature around, you know, how does evidence shape behaviours, questions around governance, gender, and social inclusion in using knowledge. So I'm excited about the idea of developing a sort of a research question or set of questions that kind of test this hypothesis that we hold very dearly to our hearts, that authentic research collaboration built on principles of equity will support sustainable change. We need that evidence, because if we really want to make the kind of equitable partnerships movement mean something, and there's a lot of cynicism about it, right? Quite understandably in the South. If we really want it to mean something, I think we need to generate that evidence. So, you know, we're hoping that we're clear that this research would have to be shaped by researchers and practitioners who are familiar with these very specific contexts, while donors and global institutions could clearly do even more than they are, or to create spaces for mutual knowledge exchange that kind of really can transcend disciplines, geographies, and sectors. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you to all, Emily, Fajri, and James, for a really stimulating presentation. A lot there. Already, I can say that there's quite a lot is emerging in the chat. And I'll just perhaps, before we go into our discussants, maybe just to highlight a few things which are just coming up, and perhaps the discussants would like to sort of factor these things as they're thinking about their views. I think, as James, you just said, that it's quite amazing, actually, the number of connections, I think, between different fields of work where, you know, for example, the work that we're also engaged in around looking at equity and power relations in research partnerships, you know, issues, I think, about, as we heard from Emily right at the beginning, about how we can join up these efforts more intentionally, because at the moment, I think there's a lot of fragmentation in the broader field. You know, really sort of centering humility and reflexivity into kind of all of these approaches, whoever we may be, in terms of where we're coming in our positionality. I think also putting power and equity right at the center of these debates. And I saw in the chat, for example, that Josha had mentioned that, you know, is interested that we're not just talking about technical solutions, but also bringing political analyses lens. I think Ariane also picked up very much on, you know, on the discussion, as did Jane, around multiple knowledges and whose knowledge counts. And, you know, sometimes the challenges that we're seeing, very rigid and limiting frameworks associated with research quality and research excellence, which are essentially owned by many research organizations in the global north. So how are they really bringing about change, and what's the level of willingness to bring about change? And then I think great interest in, you know, more examples about how these issues around knowledge translation are playing out, perhaps in specific contexts like in South Asia. So there's just a few things which are coming up in the chat already, and I throw those in, ready for our discussants now to be reflecting on what they've heard as well. We have 3 excellent discussants today. Sadly, we were to have 4, and I'll just say, unfortunately, Ronan Jumbi, who was going to join us, has been caught up in airport chaos, probably is the right word to describe it. So sadly, she couldn't join us, but we appreciate her continued interest. For our 3 discussants who will be joining us very shortly, we have Andrea Ordonez, who's Executive Director of Southern Voice, which is a network of over 60 think tanks from Africa, Latin America, and Caribbean and Asia, leveraging Southern evidence and analysis to promote fair global development debates. Andrea is an economist by training, was previously Research Director at Grupo Faro, a think tank in Ecuador, where in fact she is going to speak to us from Ecuador, and she chaired the advisory group of the KT in the Global South Research Project. We'll then hear from Leah Ioko, who's a research associate at the African Research Impact Network, ARIN, which gives a platform to early career researchers to upscale research uptake in Africa. And she has contributed to multiple projects geared towards linking science and policy. And then we'll also hear from Owusu Boampong, who is a senior research fellow and head of the Department of Integrated Development Studies at the University of Cape Coast, Ghana. And he researches and advocates for the empowerment and inclusion of marginalized communities operating in the informal economy in national policy engagements. So I'm going to invite our 3 discussants to share their responses to a first overarching question, and then we will get into some more specific questions after that. So the big question we'd invite you to share your reflections, first of all, is based on what we've heard from the report and the presentations, how can we pioneer new understandings of how to mobilize evidence in diverse settings? So, Andrea, could I invite you to share your thoughts first, and then we'll go to Leah and then to Aude.
Thank you, Peter. And first to thank IDS and OTT for the invitation to be part of this project, because it has been a learning opportunity, I think, for all of the steering group that was involved. And Uzu will, of course, also share his perspective as a member. But just on behalf of all of us, it was an enriching experience. I think that I would like to kick off the conversation with a bit of a broader comment in the sense that we've heard from Emily, from Farji, that the KT is not the problem, and that KT cannot be separated from the rest of the activities of research. And through these lenses that we've asked ourselves to, and that Peter has also invited us to look at the issues from, I think one of the key questions is, why have we separated KT as an object of study? And who does this serve to? And I want to be provocative about this, because I am not sure if the literature about knowledge translation generated so far in the Global South has been that useful for the researchers in the Global South. It would be great to hear from others in the call and the others attending your perspectives on these. Of course, this is just a question at this stage. But what I'm trying to get to is that maybe what is important before we frame, the research question and pioneering new ways of thinking is first being a bit more critical about whether the separation of KT so much as a field is serving us, and who has it served so far? Why has it been useful? Why has it grown this way? And based on this, I think that the first question is asking, those that have not been involved in the KT, and this has also been brought up in the research, all those actors that have been left out from these processes. What are the questions? What are the issues that they would like to understand better? Because I think that the objective of this type of research should not only be to inform the strategies and the priorities of donors, but actually the change happening in these countries, right? So we need to understand actually not only what are these organizations doing, but what is the type of knowledge that they would find useful to improve and to work through with in their own contexts. So I think that's an important first point that I wanted to bring up today. And I think that this is important, and I know that Kristin mentioned that we don't want to stay in the definitions, and Fashri mentioned all the technical, the different terms that are used in the discussion. But these are how the power differences and the dynamics start, right? So I don't think we should shy away from them. And if we are willing to, let go of those more strict borders of KT, then we would see that there are some more structural problems that are affecting the knowledge sector more broadly, and that would need attention, like some of the ones that have been highlighted in the chat already, like the incentives for research and then the definitions of quality and so on that affect many of the problems that we find currently within the knowledge systems. So I'll start with that, Peter, so that we can keep the conversation going.
Thanks, Andrea. It's always good to start with some provocative questions as well, which I'm sure we'll build on as we continue. Leah, can I turn to you, please?
Yes, thank you for the opportunity. I hope that you can hear me loud and clear. My name is Leah from the Africa Research and Impact Network, and coincidentally, yesterday I was attending a webinar on knowledge translation, albeit specifically to the health sector. But just a few reflections based on the report that has been presented to us. First, good analysis, excellent synthesis we've seen there. And I think I'd just like to kick off by stating that we need to look at the needs of the people we are addressing. When we are discussing research, when you're looking at knowledge translation, who is at the center of this conversation? And this, I believe, are the communities that are impacted when you look at the context of the Global South. And I really appreciate their perspectives that came out from the presentation. How are the communities going to benefit from this knowledge translation process? Because that then also informs the quality or the nature of evidence that is going to be utilized. I think one of the things that I have seen from working in the knowledge translation project at ARIN is that some of the people we expect to translate this knowledge may not find it very useful, may not be able to appreciate its value, may not be able to appreciate the value of evidence. And so it shows you that there needs to be some groundwork of some sorts to involve them from the very inception of research activities, from the very inception of conceptualizing even some of the interests that would be involved. Because another angle that comes up is the power balances, as has been mentioned. Communities might have their needs, the political class might have their preferences, the economic class might have their preferences. The donors and the funders also are expecting, certain objectives to be met, as well as the implementers who are expecting to meet certain objectives as well. So there needs to be sort of a unity of purpose when you're talking about knowledge translation, that once we have conducted this research, or once we have this body of evidence that we are collecting, how can this benefit the community? And I think one of the community representatives that was discussing these aspects yesterday really mentioned and emphasized on a participatory model from the people who are supposed to be implementing. And also another thing that they said is that we don't really need you to be brokers in some of these instances. Give us the agency and strengthen our capacity to be able to generate some of this evidence, to be able to sort of strengthen and galvanize some of this evidence that would be useful in the process. So do not look at us as people who are waiting to be spoken for in the knowledge translation process. We too can have a voice in saying, this is what this evidence means to us, and this is how we'd like to see it sort of pan out or to see it implemented. So I think just as a kicker, let us always sort of remember the people who are at the center of this conversation, the people who this is supposed to benefit. I think from a global South perspective, that would be very, very central. Thanks.
Thanks, Leah. And definitely these are questions we're going to come back to again in a minute, because I think you're really putting some important points on the table right now. Also, let's hear your thoughts on this first big overarching question.
Thank you very much, Peter, and good afternoon to everyone. Let me say, as an academic in the Global South, and in particular from Africa, there have been calls on academics and researchers to align their research agenda with national priorities. And the expectation is that for researchers to collaborate with users of our research outputs. The situation is, and in the context of limited funding for research, several volumes of research work are produced in our institutions and universities and by our think tanks, but these outputs remain unused by the broader society. So with limited resources, we have to be effective in producing knowledge that is used in practice. So my question is, or the question I want to raise in this regard is, do we need more knowledge, or we need more relevant knowledge or usable knowledge? If we need more usable knowledge, then what should our researchers, or let me say our elite researchers, know about producing knowledge that is usable by the wider society? What should researchers, particularly in the Global South, do to be able to translate knowledge they produce into action. As you have learned, co-production is an important approach for producing usable knowledge. It appears quite a lot is known about this. But what to do in terms of translating what we know into action requires additional attention. What should researchers do to ensure that what they know is used by practitioners and policy makers? And do the researchers have the capacity to do so? I must say, as a researcher, I must say research training and capacity building may be needed here. I'm fortunate to have been an alumnus of IDS short course on shaping policy with evidence. Again, let me say that I'm still a student who is learning the rudiments of how to shape policy and practice with rigorous research outputs. So there's a general lack of understanding of approaches that can enable us, or that can ensure that enable us to integrate additional skills into producing rigorous knowledge, and at the same time ensure that knowledge produced is used in practice. And in the process, we should not underestimate the experiential and informal channels of learning. I think Fagel and others alluded to that. The informal systems of knowing are very, very important. So how do academics, how do researchers integrate or incorporate, for instance, experiential and hands-on learning approaches to ensuring that they can effectively translate knowledge, action into practice? For me to conclude, there's a suggestion for a focus on the assessment of the capacities of researchers to mobilize usable knowledge in the areas, for instance, for stakeholder collaboration and social learning. These are important because very often you have academics that are used to traditional regimes of producing rigorous and scientific knowledge within the walls of the university. And they are excited when their pieces are published in high impact journals. But then we need to orient that. We need to build the capacity of these elite researchers or researchers to be able to translate what they've been able to produce in the world of the university, the wider society that needs this research outputs. So I believe that the focus should also be on the capacities and the core competencies of researchers in the global south, like myself, to be able to translate this knowledge into use, into social change. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, and again, I think it's really good that you've introduced another dimension there around capacities. I think you mentioned as well that you're also learning. I think on this regard, we're all lifelong learners trying to grapple with these questions, which is why these conversations are so important and bringing these different perspectives. So thanks for that. Andrea, if I could come back to you. You were obviously, as chair of the steering group for this piece of work, you were quite engaged with, with the work as it progressed, and of course, I'm sure you've given lots of attention to the final report. You spoke just now about the fact that many of these conversations are still sort of, I guess, coalescing around actors in the global north who tend to lead these discussions and ask the questions. And you just highlighted that for many researchers in what we'll refer to just now as the global south, they're not really being given the opportunity yet to ask the questions or to frame the questions which are important to them about these issues. From your position within Southern Voice in particular, which is obviously a network of think tanks across many countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean, what's your sense of how this work, this research and these findings can help generate efforts to be more inclusive, more engaging, essentially helping to level the playing field, which will allow researchers not just to be answering questions, but to be asking the questions themselves?
Thank you, Peter, for the question. I think for me, these conclusions that I mentioned that have been highlighted before by the presenters, that KT is not a problem and that KT is not separated from other aspects, are key in the sense that they set some initial evidence for the opportunity to probably get rid of the term altogether, and to think through not through these lenses, because I think that's the problem. So probably, Emily did an extensive search of literature, but of course, if you are asking it through the lenses of a type of expertise that has been described as in the KT sector, as James highlighted also in the chat around tools and about these specific processes. If we keep asking the questions within the same framework, it's not only about giving the opportunity for researchers in the Global South to engage with this research, but if it's not relevant or they don't find it as something to invest their time in, why keep pushing for that, right? So that is, I think, why I started with this of the sector itself. If it makes sense to try to make this framing of KT and how it has developed so far inclusive, or if we just need to rethink of a different way of framing the sector altogether with the inputs and perspectives from the Global South. And Leah has done a great job in introducing some of those concerns and ideas that would be central in these. And I think we have to challenge this, because also the interesting thing with a field is that the field comes with its experts, right? And of course, institutions in the Global North have made a space for this knowledge translation field, maybe also as an opportunity to create a label of an expertise, right? That maybe organizations in the Global South do not relate to, on how it's framed, but actually the practical knowledge of how to do it is within these organizations, right? So these are the sorts of questions that I think need to be addressed before we move into inclusion of Southern scholars in a field, whichever one it is, and giving them the chance to set up these questions, set out what would they be interested in learning, and the funders will have to also learn that these may not be questions that relate to what they are interested in knowing necessarily, and being sort of open to supporting some of those other questions as well.
Thanks, Andrea. And that's a similar set of reflections, I think, that we're having around the conversation around equitable partnerships as well. So there's definitely some underlying principles, I think, here that we need to be grappling with, and which certainly applies to this conversation too. Leah, if I can come back to you. Actually, I'll just refer to one of the points in the chat from Wale, who said that your point centers the issue of epistemic justice in global development generally, and in KT in particular. And Wale is asking how the data is eventually disseminated and who leads that process, and is mentioning that the publication platforms are still influenced by the Global North and behind paywalls that often aren't accessible. And in fact, there's a lot of, I would call it structural exclusion, whereby whether it's research excellence frameworks, research quality frameworks, who holds the sort of publication spaces, and a lot of the dialogues, which also comes down to the language in which these things are conducted in as well, obviously tend to be maintained by groups who have power, essentially. Now, I know that you have developed a framework for KT yourself, and I wonder to what extent the work that you've done, perhaps you could share some insights from what you've done yourself. How does that relate to some of the ideas which are surfacing through this report, and perhaps speaks to some of these bigger questions about trying to help to surface agency and voice of those who currently are not able to bring that into these contexts?
I mean, thank you so much for that question. And just coming from the work that we've been doing, some of the challenges that have been highlighted in the IDS report are really some of the challenges that we encountered in interacting with the community, in interacting with the policy makers. We've had some of them tell us that we do not understand what you have presented to us simply because of the manner in which it has been presented to us. And we need this to be sort of broken down and synthesized in a way that will voice better the needs of the people you are trying to advocate for, or the needs of the people you are working, you're working towards, enhancing enhancing their livelihoods, for example. So, and the context was COVID-19, right? So you really have to pay attention to the audience, the needs of the knowledge users, because they're saying, okay, this is a report that is perfect for the funder, but this is not a report we understand, right? We do not have time amidst our political commitments to go through 80, 150 pages trying to find out sort of points for implementation. So they're like, put this in a language, in a lingo that we understand. I think in terms of partnerships, of course, just even from the outset, most of it is not equitable. Perhaps I find that when we are delving into the sort of the project implementation and the nitty-gritties, the other party realizes that, yeah, this setup is one that we need to be flexible and adjust so that we have an equitable format in which you can operate. You have your priorities. You can also speak to the objectives. You can also speak to the research questions. We can also involve, for example, the community, even at the inception stage, for that to just sort of inform the general overview or the general format for any research exercise. In terms of publishing, I think at the Africa Research and Impact Network, this is a very huge challenge that we found and we have observed. And we said, if we are not going to be given space at the table, we had better build our own table, you know? So we are looking at partnering with various publishers, specifically Taylor and Francis, who have sort of agreed to have a certain specific editions dedicated to African research and presenting African evidence using the African voice and context. So that is the proactiveness that we want to see amongst African researchers. Every Friday, we hold a review where we invite researchers working in various aspects. Other people contribute and say, this is what we're working on. What do you think about this? And we're able to consolidate. If any other person is working in the same area, just bringing ideas together and seeing how is this going to translate sort of to the needs of the communities? How is this going to translate to policy? How is this going to have a socio-economic, cultural or political lens? So just even troubleshooting at that point, so that our evidence is not lying in bookshelves or libraries or awaiting publication in some journal, that will never get published. Our evidence is living. It's a living format of evidence. So I think that, coupled with amongst, other efforts that are being done, I'm sure, by other organizations, we can definitely strengthen the table that we have from the global south, so that it is not just identifying sort of the challenges, but addressing them from our own perspectives, because we are the ones who understand the challenges. I think the last point I wanted to mention was knowledge translation looks different for different people. I mean, we formulated our sort of knowledge translation format with the policy makers, and I wish I could share it, but it was a really simplified version. And for them, they're like, we need to see, we need knowledge that speaks to the needs of the community. So even before you go further in the discussion, they'll ask you, so who is being affected? And how is this going to help them? That's all they want to know, because they want to see the face, they want to see the voice that is being represented, whether it's the urban poor, whether it's the women, children, and that's sort of the only way that they see the sense in implementing it in terms of policy. So definitely looks different in various contexts, but yeah, we need to galvanize and strengthen our agency as African researchers. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Leo. And I think your emphasis on context and agency are absolutely spot on. I love that. I love that phrase, building your own table, as well. I think that's a great metaphor, which I think offers some really interesting possibilities for doing things differently. Essentially, you also made the point, which was appreciated in the chat, about really trying to understand the needs and interests of those with whom researchers are engaging, in order to try to align that. Just anecdotally, some years back, I was working with IDRC in a program called the Think Tank Initiative. We did a survey of what different policy stakeholders were really interested in accessing in terms of evidence. And of course, policy briefs are very commonly used. And in fact, many of the policy actors said the least popular vehicle for research, for sharing research outcomes was the policy brief, which was interesting because most projects usually say, well, yes, what are the outputs? A policy brief. And then many policy actors said they didn't find policy briefs terribly useful. And actually one mentioned a policy brief that was 150 pages long, which I think that suggests why a different table is needed. So thanks, that was really insightful. Also, can I come back to you? And I just want to dig a bit more into your comments about capacity, because I think you made a very powerful point that in order for researchers to engage with different actors in their own context, there perhaps are capacity needs which are relevant. Obviously, a lot of capacity building approaches which are associated particularly with development programs are often associated with a sort of deficit model where there's that sense, well, something is lacking. But I picked up from what you said that you sense there are existing capacities that can be shared, rather than perceiving that these things are just absent. So I just wondered if you could say a bit more, perhaps drawing on some of your own experience about how you see this issue of capacities being addressed in more equitable ways.
Yes, so I will first take from the point of researchers, their capacities to translate knowledge that they produce. And I'm happy Leah alluded to the fact that sometimes we produce knowledge and the people that we think we are supposed to help don't even understand what we produce, the knowledge that we produce. So it's important that researchers in a part of the world are willing to sit at the table with the users of knowledge. And we need that orientation. Not most early researchers are oriented in that manner to sit with the users at the table. Also because of, I think, a mismatch in terms of values and goals. To the researcher or somebody like me in the academic field, it's more about promotion because you're obligated to publish for promotion. And so therefore, we don't see the need even to go out there and share whatever that we could do with a bigger society. So our belief is first and foremost about orienting ourselves as researchers, that what we produce, the knowledge we produce should be useful or should be usable by the bigger society that we live in. Because for instance, in the universities, it's very clear our mandate is to research, outreach, and teaching. But very often the focus of the research, teaching, and then we forget the outreach aspect. It's because sometimes we don't have the tools to be able to do it effectively. And Peter alluded to the policy briefs. Not everybody, not most researchers in our part of the world even understand the whole concept of policy briefs, the language that's understandable to the bigger society. I've had the benefit of working with an NGO, and it's so frustrating and difficult for us when we are working with marginalized communities, breaking down very technical research output to them. Sometimes you have to convert it to infographics. You have to convert it to video messages that they can understand. But most researchers are in our part of the world do not even don't have these tools to be able to convert, for instance, very difficult technical research pieces into language that is understandable by the users. Okay. The other thing has to do with finance. I mean, it's a big issue everywhere. So in a part of the world, there's about 0.5% of our GDP is devoted to research. So the question is, how do we mobilize enough financial resources to be able to carry out more high quality research? It could be advocating for government to devote more resources to that. But that is a challenge because of the fact that most governments are part of the world also financially challenged. So finance is important in terms of building our capacity. Our own training as researchers is also very, very important. We need to train ourselves. I mean, you alluded to lifelong learning, continuously educate ourselves about the most effective ways of communicating our research findings to the bigger society. Thank you.
Thank you. So let's have one more round with our discussants, and then perhaps we'll just quickly also return to our original presenters to see if they have any final points to share. And in the chat, there's still some more interesting points and questions being raised. I think, you know, one point is about obviously the kind of global challenges that we're seeing are being felt in different ways everywhere in the world, perhaps around climate change, around conflict, food insecurity. Obviously, the pandemic is another example. Are these global challenges in a way driving greater opportunities for multiple forms of knowledge, perhaps to be appreciated and valued? And also, does it mean that global North actors are realizing, perhaps at a rather late stage in the game, that they don't have all the answers, and that this multiplicity of knowledge and experience is absolutely crucial in order to respond to these global challenges? And then also, Nana mentioned that participatory knowledge translation may be an approach to consider. So perhaps more participatory approaches can also be helpful. So maybe we just have one last round on any final reflections. Andrea, if I can start with you. Yeah, any final points you want to leave us with?
Well, yeah, I think that this question of the value of knowledge for these global challenges poses an interesting point of reflection also of you know, how difficult this change really is, right? And that many times when we are planning projects in the sense of how they're thought of in international development or global development, it's like a small project is expected to change the world, right? But then when you think about your own context or your issues closer to home, you realize that actually changing things, the politics, the power dynamics in any context are very difficult. So I think that's also something that would benefit from. That's another benefit of kind of like not othering, and as was mentioning or highlighting the difficulties that are present in all settings. And so maybe these global issues and challenges have that opportunity to shed light on these common issues around the use of evidence on power, politics, and so on, that are present everywhere, but sometimes we forget that they are. Yeah.
Leah.
Thank you. And I think just to comment on that is that, of course, the global challenges have really been, quote unquote, a blessing in disguise. We are seeing that, you know, we too can have solutions. We too can, you know, give a voice into whatever interventions, police interventions that are being made in emergency settings. So that has really strengthened, I think, the agency and sort of the confidence in, quote unquote, the African evidence or the global South evidence. So the global North does not have all the solutions, but neither does the global South. So it's just a matter of collaboration and inclusivity in an equitable partnership that can really sort of strengthen the knowledge translation framework that we want to see in our various contexts. Thank you.
Thanks, Leah. Owusu, would you like to share some final thoughts with us?
Yes, so I will say that the whole idea of Northern scholars and Southern scholars when it comes to knowledge translation, I believe, is somehow artificial. And Northern scholars and Southern scholars can collaborate in producing research that is usable. But also, we cannot be naive that there's also the issue of power relation between Northern scholars and Southern scholars in the collaborative research processes. So my suggestion is that in terms of the framing research questions and design research methodology, I think there could be an equal relationship between Northern scholars and Southern scholars in coming out research that is usable, particularly in the global South. Thank you.
Thanks, Owusu. So let's just hear just some final reflections from our original presenters, having now heard this really interesting discussion and had the opportunity to see the questions in the chat. I can see there's been some discussion in the chat and a lot of sharing of resources as well, which has been fantastic. But maybe I can just go in reverse order from our original presenters and just ask James, Fajri, and then Emily, perhaps just to share any final thoughts. And then Kristen, if you also, since you began the session for us, if you have any last thoughts as well to share, that would be great. So James.
Thank you, and thanks everyone. It's been brilliant. Three quick things from me. There's so much I could comment on, but this issue of, are we carrying on with the charade that KT experts are in the north? I mean, absolutely not. I like to go into every meeting with a new set of partners who are based in the global south. And I like to start off by reminding them about Brexit and the UK's response to the first wave of COVID, and say, you couldn't really find a country that makes a worse use of evidence or makes a worse job of knowledge translation than my own. So, I think as researchers, in development, we tend to agree on this point, but clearly the wider sector and structures that we're dealing with do still try and promote this idea of northern expertise, which is a big problem. I just to reiterate what's been going on in the chat, there's an issue with this research in that it was called KT in the global south, and we didn't really like KT and we didn't really like global south, and we just had to deal with that. But no, I mean, absolutely, as we've said and Andrea has said, there's a real set of issues around this kind of separation of KT and its very, very narrow way it gets defined. Absolutely would be very happy if this research can contribute to us no longer kind of using that term, or certainly not using it in the same way. It's not a helpful lens, and yes, it does favour certain perspectives over others. And finally, there's been a lot of stuff in the chat about what we can sort of do about all this stuff. And I mean, we did make some really clear recommendations, particularly for funders, which IDRC have embraced. And now I think they need our support to kind of spread the word to other funders. And, this urgent need to rapidly localise or decentralise the funding decisions and the design of research and its evaluation is right up there, as well as supporting changes to broader knowledge systems rather than focusing only very narrowly on particular KT initiatives. So thank you. Got a lot to think about, and I'll pass on to Fadri.
Great, thanks, James. And also thanks, Peter. I've been so immersed with the data that we've collected during this research, I haven't really been able to take stock and really reflect on this. So I'm actually also quite thankful to James for introducing the cycle he presented in one of the final slides. I think that will be really useful for future discussions on KT, be it in a more conceptual or empirical level. But a different reflection I was thinking about it's not actually from this research, but based on my own experience working in the evidence to policy field in Indonesia. And that is the limitations to evidence-based policy if you try to perceive these different issues from a political economy lens. And I think Emily also mentioned this based on her findings in the lit review. And maybe a political economy lens towards evidence use is something that all researchers and practitioners can reflect on, regardless being based in the global north or global south, because probably that is one area where we all see the limitations of knowledge translation, I guess, because the political context might be different in the global south, but when it comes to power relations, I think that's something universal. And I've seen so many limitations to evidence-based policy in the Indonesian context. So maybe that's something also we can also discuss about in future discussions.
Thanks, Fadri. Emily and Kristen, any brief final reflections?
Yeah, I'll be very brief. I'm really thankful to our discussants in particular for their insights. Really excellent points across the board. And yeah, I mean, I came into this literature review not actually being a KT expert. I have some experience speaking to policymakers and practitioners as an academic, so that was my kind of lived experience of it. But then my own my own areas of specialization as an academic are more about human rights and how to use political science and social science analysis more broadly to advance human rights. And so that very much echoes what Fadri was also saying about, the limitations of evidence-based, policy making. And I just also want to echo, I think, a point that I think we all agree on, which is I don't necessarily think, the factors are different in the global north and in the global south. The key factors, the power issues, etc. So again, for me, quite a bit of the issues we've raised, we actually don't necessarily need a ton more of evidence. For me, it's more about doing than researching. And so maybe it's one of those rare cases where you're going to hear an academic say, no, actually, I don't think we need more evidence. I think we might need to do things. So we might need to shift power. We need to, listen, but I'm not sure we need, to keep doing more research into this. I think quite a few things have emerged clearly. So there may be specific, sub areas that still need a bit more research. But for me, it might be the point of, let's do things rather than let's do more research. So that's my closing point, I'd say.
Thanks, Emily. And also is saying to know and to do. Both of those are important. And perhaps we don't need any more KT experts. That may be one of the outcomes of this conversation, actually. Perhaps that's a position that is now going to be permanently vacant. Kristen, any last quick thoughts from your side?
No, thank you, Peter. In the interest of time, I'll let you close, but it's really just to say thank you to everyone. The entire learning journey through this project has been so fascinating, and I've loved the opportunity to discuss and debate, and it's been great to sort of see that again today, and looking forward to taking things farther.
Great, thanks, Kristen. And the chat has been fantastic. It continues. I can see email addresses are being shared, links are being shared. Wally suggests that perhaps we're all KT experts, so maybe that's a good way to bring this session to a close. Just a couple of final remarks. We have a forthcoming IDS bulletin, which is a special issue funded by IDRC and edited by Andrea and James, which profiles learning from sudden research organizations that rapidly mobilized in response to the COVID pandemic. I think it touches on a lot of the issues we've discussed today, and that will be available on October 24th. And you can stay up to date with research training and events focus on this field of getting evidence into use by signing up to an IDS evidence and policy newsletter. And there is a link to that in the chat. And it sounds as though this discussion is going to continue with already, I can see some potential communities of practice mobilizing, which is already a fantastic outcome. That doesn't happen often in a webinar. So thank you to all of our presenters, discussants, IDRC for supporting this work, and for all those who joined today, and of course our colleague James Murdoch in the back for James Andrews, sorry, in the back for helping our technology and ensuring that all has worked today and making it possible for us to connect on this platform. So thank you to everyone, and the conversation will undoubtedly continue. Hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. This is great. Bye.
Bye.